Chapter 1. We lost our way, and then we lost our kingdom. Bethlehem, 4 B.C. The little fire crackled with delight as a few more pieces of very dry branches and sticks were thrown atop its dancing flames. Faces near the fire reflected a reddish sheen as they watched the wood being devoured greedily. One of the men stared vacantly into the light while watching his friend's efforts to keep the fire alive. He looked at the others who sat around the flames. There wasn't much heat being thrown off, but then again, it didn't really matter. This fire was not for warmth of body, but for warmth of spirit. The evening fields outside Bethlehem were bleak and boring for watchful shepherds, and this night was no different. Or was it? Not far from the shepherds, and unseen by them, stood two figures, angels of the Lord who had been assigned to watch over these humble men of the fields. And so they watched, enjoying the occasional banter of these who faithfully watched over their flocks. And they waited.
"Good sirs, why are we watching these particular men?"
asked Baca. Saras, who had been apprenticed to Michael, and was now mentoring Baca in the ways and means of serving the Most High on earth, looked at his charge.
"We are watching these men because the Lord has ordered it so,"
said Saras. Baca stood silent for a moment more, and then spoke again.
"But what are we to be doing in particular?"
he finally managed to ask.
"I thought I was sent to earth to engage the enemy, not to shepherd shepherds."
Saras smiled at Baca's eagerness. He recalled all too well his first assignment with Michael. He too had been very zealous and had driven Michael to exasperation because of his desire to get in the war firsthand. Baca was a good angel, recently released from the Academy of the Host, where he had been trained in the art of warfare for the Most High. He was ready now to take the things he had learned and apply them in glorious battle for the Most High God.
"Every assignment is important, Baca," said Saras. "The war is fought on many fronts and in many ways." "Yes, I know, good teacher," said Baca. "But I wish to do something significant, something that will make a difference in the war."
Saras indicated the shepherds before them.
"Every decision that humans make, every action they take, every thought they think makes a difference in the war. Our duty is to uphold the Lord's authority in heaven and on earth by serving these men made in God's image."
They walked over to the campfire, where the men were enjoying a bit of meat cooked over the fire. Saras turned to Baca.
"Look at these men, Baca. They are poor and simple shepherds in the eyes of men. They have no real importance to anyone outside their families. And yet the Most High loves each of these as much as he loved the great kings of the past, even David himself. Our duty is to serve the Lord by serving them, to help them in their times of trial when they call upon the name of God in prayer, to protect them when we can from the enemy who seeks to devour them, because he is jealous of the Lord's great love of them. The war is being fought here and now in the minds and hearts of men, even these simple shepherds who love God and look to him for their deliverance. And you have been assigned to one of these men in particular, a man who has become discouraged of heart and mind." "Which man?" asked Baca.
He eagerly surveyed the group, hoping that it was perhaps the brawny fellow, who seemed to be more a soldier than a shepherd. Saras coyly gave him a "you'll have to wait a bit more" sort of look, holding up his hand to stop their conversation. The words of a little boy of about 8, a son of one of the shepherds, had caught Saras' attention.
"Listen, and hear how the minds of humans work," he said, smiling. "But how old was King David when he killed Goliath?" the boy, whose name was Joshua, asked, continuing the line of questioning about his favorite hero, which had dominated the conversation thus far. The men smiled at the boy's curiosity about men and women of their past. Joshua's father,
A gentleman whose sunburned skin belied his age smiled down at his little boy. He looked around at the other men, some of whom also had their sons with them. He then answered, as if in deep thought,
"Well, Joshua, as I was saying, that was a long time ago. But I think he wasn't too much older than you when he killed the giant and saved Israel." "But before that he had killed lions and all sorts of other animals, right?"
said the boy, who made sure he could feel his little sling nearby. He kept a wary eye out for any intruding animals.
"Yes, that's true," said the father, Elron. "King David killed many wild animals before he met Goliath."
The men settled in around the fire. They enjoyed drinking in the stories they themselves had grown up with. There was comfort in reliving the glory days of Israel in the face of the present bitter occupation.
"But Joshua, you must realize that David didn't kill the giant,"
Elron said, taking the sling from the boy's fidgety hands.
"The Lord Almighty killed Goliath, just as he promises to destroy all our enemies."
As he finished speaking, the raucous sounds of drunken Roman officers roaring through the streets and chariots drifted up the hillside from the edge of town. The father turned toward the noise, and then back to his son, who was still looking toward the sound of the disturbance.
"Yes, even the Romans will be defeated one day," he said resignedly. "The Lord will avenge us someday." "Not the Messiah again," said Daniel, another of the shepherds.
"Yes, Daniel, the Messiah," said Elron. He gave them all a look of confidence.
"He will come one day and save his people."
Daniel shook his head in disgust. He pointed toward the town and said,
"The only thing the Romans will ever understand is violence. They killed my brother for some stupid, senseless reason. They only understand blood. You know that."
After a few moments of tense silence, the boy Joshua suddenly spoke up, sincerely puzzled by Daniel's statement.
"But don't you believe the Messiah will come someday?"
he asked quietly. Elron looked hard at Daniel as the man framed his answer. Daniel, in turn, looked at all the other men, particularly the fathers who held their sons close to them.
"I hope your father is right, Joshua," he said finally. "I hope that there is a Messiah, an anointed one, who will come and save us."
He then looked at the rest of the men.
"But until that happens, we must be prepared to meet force with force." "We learned long ago that the might of men gains nothing," came the voice of Eli, an ancient shepherd whose wisdom was respected by all. "That is how we came to lose our freedom to so many. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greek kingdoms, and now the Romans. We lost our way, and then we lost our kingdom."
Daniel stood up, agitated now.
"We don't need a lesson in how many times we have been occupied, dear Eli," he said, throwing up his hands. "Surely you don't propose that we wait out the Romans." "In the Lord's timing, the Messiah will come," said Eli. "And when he does, he will set things right."
"When he comes, said Daniel. He walked off, disgusted by the way the conversation had gone, as well as by the way he had handled it. As he walked, he brushed up against Baca, never knowing that he had touched an angel, and stood in the darkness, staring down at Bethlehem. The angel was amused at the man's reaction to such profound wisdom spoken by the old shepherd. He turned again to the conversation.
"But didn't we have to fight to gain the land in the first place?"
asked another boy, Jared, who was about 13 years old.
"We had great armies then."
True, said Eli, shutting his eyes and folding his hands in front of him.
"Israel had a great army then."
The other shepherds began huddling close, bringing in more wood for the fire, settling in for the evening. They knew Eli was about to tell a story that would not only fill their hearts and minds, but also help to pass the long night. "It was a glorious victory that brought us into this land," Eli began, as if seeing it all in his mind. "A great series of victories begun by Joshua." He looked at the little boy and winked at him. "Your namesake," he added. The boy grinned proudly. So did his father. "But Joshua himself realized that without the Lord there would be no victory at all. He depended on the Lord. After the great victory at Jericho, where the sound of trumpets brought down the proud walls, Joshua found himself defeated by Ai, a very little town that should have fallen very easily." Eli sat up and shook his finger at the men. "And that was the beginning of a great lesson for our fathers of that day. They had begun to lose their way, even as they were in the midst of great victories." As Eli recounted the great days of Israel, the two angels walked away from the shepherds. A voice came from behind them. It was Gabriel. "Greetings, my brothers," he said. "A glorious night for a glorious event." "Gabriel," said Saras, who had been assigned to watch over the shepherds until the rest of the host arrived. "Welcome, my brother." Baca also greeted Gabriel. "We were listening to this man Eli," he said. "He is speaking of the days of Joshua." "You would do well to listen to this man and learn how the faith and minds of humans work," said Gabriel, looking at the very bright star that hung in the heavens over Bethlehem. He indicated Daniel, who remained standoffish. "He also would do well to listen to Eli." "He seems to listen to nobody," scoffed Baca. "He'll hear none of it. He's a very difficult man." "Yes, Baca, he is extremely troubled," Gabriel said calmly. "Tonight is a very important night for him. That is why I am giving you charge over him." "What?" responded Baca, obviously exasperated. "You are assigning me to Daniel? But I thought perhaps I could be with one of the Levites, or perhaps that cantankerous Lippius, you know, the one who's spoiling to fight the Romans." "Daniel is a troubled man who needs a compassionate guardian," said Gabriel. "He also needs direction. You have been assigned to see to both of those things. Tonight." "Yes, my lord," said Baca, still puzzled by his new assignment. Gabriel led Baca over toward the place where Daniel stood. The man was quietly weeping, staring at the sky in the direction of the bright star that had recently appeared over the land. "Why is tonight so critical?" asked Baca sheepishly. "I mean, why must there be a resolution tonight?" "This man matters," said Gabriel pointedly, "as all men do. And tonight all that Eli speaks about will speak to what shall happen in Bethlehem very soon. This will be a night that is very important to both Daniel and you." Baca started to respond, but Gabriel forbade him, motioning for him rather to listen to the words of the old man. Baca walked over next to Daniel. He did indeed have compassion for the man. Since Daniel was now his charge, Baca was determined to do all that was allowed within his power to see this man back to God. Baca sidled up next to Daniel and spoke gently into his mind. "Why don't you listen to the old man?" He looked at Gabriel and then Eli and muttered to himself, "Sounds as if we both need to hear him out." At first Daniel didn't respond, but after a few more urgings he glanced over at the other shepherds. He sat down, still staring into the little city of Bethlehem, but he cocked his head in such a way as to hear what was being discussed. Baca grinned at Gabriel and Saras, who nodded in affirmation. Baca then sat next to Daniel and listened to Eli. The old man was quite a storyteller, eloquent and compelling. Even Gabriel caught himself listening with great interest as the story unfolded. From those days after the crossing of Jordan into Canaan, to the days when Israel was a new nation with a great vision, to the days when Joshua was leader over the people, days of a very different time with a very determined enemy, days that were all a part of the Most High's glorious plan to bring the seed of the woman, the Messiah, to save the earth. Chronicles of the Host, Nations' Eve. It was with much anticipation that the host observed the passing of the mantle of leadership from Moses to Joshua. Now a man of 80, Joshua was to lead the people into the land for which they had waited over 400 years. Poised inside their walled cities on the other side of the Jordan, the Canaanite kings, steeped in idolatry and in agreement with every vile and detestable behavior possible, awaited the impending invasion. Lucifer and his princes over Canaan had made sure that the people of the land were alert to the ambitions of the Hebrews. They had communicated through the forbidden arts of the Canaanite priests, in visions and dreams and ecstatic utterances, the darkness that was encroaching from the east. The cry went throughout the land that the people who had humbled Ramses were now closing in, and so the Canaanites prepared as best they could for the coming battle, never knowing that they were smaller pieces in a much larger game. East of Jordan, 1225 B.C.
"They are behaving like maddened hornets on that side of Jordan," said Chrylis, one of Michael's warrior scouts, as he reported on the movements of the enemy in Canaan. "They know that the Lord is about to move, and they are in a panic." He smiled. "In fact, when they saw me coming in with a few other warriors for a closer look, they thought the attack had begun, and began scattering like the wind."
Michael nodded in acknowledgment of the report, and looked across the great river to the other side where, unseen to the humans, a great cloud had gathered across the sky facing them. "Make no mistake, my friend," said Michael. "True, some of the enemy are frightened, but there are untold thousands of the enemy in the land," he said, "and not all of them are given to fright."
"Yes, they have been entrenched there for quite a while," agreed Chrylis. "They won't give up their territory easily."
"Nevertheless, they shall give it up," said Michael, glancing at the holy angels who continued to pour into the area above the Israelites. "Our numbers are increasing as the people continue praying, according to Joshua's recent command. Then you shall see that dark cloud scattered once and for all." The holy angels, with Michael, provided a covering of sorts, shielding the people from incursions that were frequently attempted by roving devils who penetrated the lines just enough to streak through the camp. Lucifer had assigned them to spread fear throughout the nation of Israel, fear of walled cities and giants and unimaginable evil. But they caused little real harm. They were powerless operating in proximity of a people so near to the presence of the Lord. Michael glanced at Joshua, who was himself at that very moment also peering across the Jordan. How strong he looked! At 80 years of age, Joshua seemed stronger than ever. The Lord had certainly chosen well the man who would carry the people into the land of promise. Michael remembered how, 40 years earlier, Joshua had entered the land with Caleb and the other spies, how 10 spies had brought back a report to Moses and the people that the land was good, but that it would be impossible to conquer, how Joshua and Caleb had almost been stoned by the people for encouraging them that the Lord was with them to take the land, how God had judged that generation unworthy to enter the land, and how Joshua and Caleb had waited until this day to finally return to the land flowing with milk and honey. Now they were ready to enter the land of promise. But were the people ready to fight? That had been the running debate among Joshua's leadership. The Lord had recently spoken to Joshua, encouraging him, and Joshua had resolved with his warriors that the attack would occur soon, and would include those men from the tribes whose land was already secured on this side of the river. And so it was that Joshua now gazed across the Jordan, readying his heart and mind for the coming conquest. 2 men approached Joshua. They were dressed in clothing more Canaanite in appearance than Hebrew. They listened and nodded as he instructed them, and then they set off across the river, disappearing into the cool water. Joshua silently prayed God's favor upon the spies he was sending to scout out the strength of Jericho. "Here they come again!" came a shout from somewhere down below. As Joshua watched his spies make it safely to the other side, several very large demons, unseen by Joshua or any other human, battered their way into the camp, breaking through a line of holy angels, and entered a tent belonging to one of Joshua's generals. Try as they might, Michael's angels could not remove them. A great row occurred as holy angels found themselves unable to make the demons budge. The demons merely laughed at Michael when he approached them. They stood over the figure of a general who was clearly depressed. With his head resting on his hands, he stared blankly at the wall of the tent.
"Poor Michael," said one of the demons. "I'm afraid this one has given us permission to be here."
"You know the rules of this war," said another laughingly. "Once a human gives us permission, there's nothing that can force us out, unless he does it himself."
"You are taking advantage of this man's discouragement," said Michael angrily. "His wife and daughter just drowned, and he is upset. But he will recover."
"He is more than upset," said the larger of the 3 demons. "He is angry at Joshua, and anger makes for good motivation."
He began speaking soothingly into the distraught man's mind.
"After all, if it weren't for Joshua dragging us to this place, your wife and daughter would still be alive."
The man began weeping tears of bitterness and anger. The demon laughed.
"You see, Michael," he said, "this man blames Joshua, and rightfully so." "And this is only one man," said another. "Sickness is beginning to break out, and more fear." He looked intently at the archangel. "I love how both sickness and fear are so contagious among humans, and so complementary. They both cause paralysis and death."
Michael left the tent and ordered angels on sentry to watch the movements of the man. Chrylis followed the archangel, wondering how he would handle the situation.
"He's correct about one thing," said Michael. "The longer we remain here, the more opportunity these foul creatures will have to exert their influence."
"But why?"
asked Chrylis, walking with Michael as they neared where Joshua now conferred with some of the elders.
"The Ark of the Testimony is here, God's very presence. Joshua is firmly in control. The vast majority of the people are with him. In fact, they took an oath to pay with their lives should they betray his leadership. Why would they give in to the enemy now?" "Because humans have a knack for weakening," said Michael, looking at another enemy incursion into the camp, this time to harass a Levite who was having marital strife and was becoming increasingly bitter toward his wife. "I have seen it all too often," Michael said resignedly. "Given time, men seem to follow the leading of their capricious natures. That is what prolongs this war."
Before Chrylis could respond, Michael vanished. He had decided to call upon one of the wisest angels in heaven for advice.